Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first seminar of 2025. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Astrid. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Global Center on Healthcare and Urbanization at Oxford, and I'll be chairing tonight's event. We are really delighted to have you here to join us for tonight's seminar, which is part of the GCHU Public Seminar series, which takes place twice a term. So in week 1 and week 8, we have these seminars and focus on topics that connect to GCHU's and Kellogg's interests around sustainable urban development and health and well-being. So in each seminar, we invite 4 speakers to give a 5-minute response to a key question or topic related to these themes. And today I want to begin by asking you, our audience, a few but simple but important questions. So have you ever found yourself in the middle of a heated disagreement, maybe about politics or climate change, or even a local neighborhood issue? And have you ever wondered why these divides seem to be getting deeper and what we can actually do about them? And most importantly, how can we create spaces where meaningful dialogue can happen, even when we don't always agree? So polarization is one of the biggest challenges we're facing today. And it's not just about the way we talk to each other, it's really about how we live together, how we make decisions, and how we address global issues like climate change, public health, and sustainable development. And polarization is really important to consider because when we are divided, making progress gets so much harder to achieve. And here in the UK and even here in Oxford, we see these divisions playing out every day, whether it's debates about Brexit or national elections or local issues like low traffic neighborhoods. These tensions really show us just how important it is to truly understand and listen to each other. And it's often in our local communities where these tensions are felt the strongest. And urbanization and cities, although they have opened up incredible opportunities, things like better healthcare, economic prosperity, and new innovations to share challenges, they have also brought its share of challenges with diverse communities sometimes pulling in different directions over competing priorities. And let's not forget the growing divide between urban and rural areas, where these differences can feel even more pronounced. So polarization isn't just a national issue. It's felt deeply within our communities. And when we take the time to really understand each other, we potentially can build stronger communities, closer-knit communities, communities that can potentially address challenges together and create a future where everyone has a place and feels they belong. So these are the topics we're going to explore today. So how do we engage with others who hold different perspectives? How do we listen without judgment? And how do we turn the energy of polarization potentially into something constructive? And we are really excited to share the findings of a recent research project here at the GCHU, which was funded by the Oxford Policy Engagement Network to explore research with real impact on policy. And in this project, we looked at the potential of listening exchanges as a way to reduce community division. And we'll hear more about this process from Bex later, but just to say that it was exploring this specific method, working with the County Council as our policy partner to see how this approach could help to reduce tensions in local communities. And if you'd like to learn more about the project, there are copies all around the room of the report available to you to take home or take a look inside. But for now, let me introduce our speakers for tonight, each of whom brings a unique perspective to this discussion. So first up, we have Beck Sutton, a mediator and facilitator of the project Listening Exchanges, and she will share her insights from her work on the project on conflict resolution at community levels. Next up, we have Professor Cesar Aguirre, an expert in bioethics and philosophy, and he will offer a global perspective on community dialogue. Then we have Ed Hodgson, a researcher with the organization More in Common, and he brings his expertise studying social dynamics of polarization and how we can shape community relationships. And last but not least, we have Kate Pumphrey, a behavioral designer and strategist, and she focuses on bridging divides and building stronger communities through psychologically informed approaches. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for being part of this conversation and sharing your insights. So now let's begin with our first speaker, Bex. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Astrid. So yeah, I'm Beck Sutton. I'm an accredited mediator and a former British diplomat. I worked in conflict zones. I focused on conflict zones. So I was in the Balkans. I was in Darfur in 2004, the first peace agreement. And I also worked in Afghanistan. And then I left the Foreign Office 10 years ago. And I've since spent 10 years, I've since spent 10 years working on interpersonal and community-based mediation. So as Astrid said, I was the facilitator for the Listening Exchange project. So what was the research about? Basically, the research was focusing on whether listening practices, which are widely used in conflict mediation processes, can be effective in the situation we found ourselves in Oxford with low traffic neighbourhoods, LTNs. There was widespread community polarisation, really strong feelings on both sides of the debate. We were inviting people to an exchange that didn't know each other beforehand, and they probably weren't going to see each other again afterwards. And there was not a problem-solving element to it. So there was no kind of decision-making that was going to happen in this process. So we wanted to see whether something almost as light as that could be effective in helping reduce polarisation. So what is a listening exchange? Basically, it's a reflective listening process with two participants, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, and it's facilitated. The context is that participants strongly disagree. So the requirement to be part of a listening exchange is that you feel strongly either in support of LTNs or against. Sort of being in the middle isn't really going to cut it, and that you're willing to listen to the other person. So it's actually quite a structured process initially. So I asked a series of questions through the listening exchange. The first was always, when you see a bollard, what do you feel? And I invited the first person to speak for 90 seconds, so it's timed. So the person who was listening to what was said then reflected back what they heard. So and then the roles reversed. But in the process of reflecting back, it was important not to sort of comment or give opinion or say, well, I agree with that bit, but not this bit, what you said. It was simply reflecting back what the person had heard. And that was took a while for some people to get that, because it's not the kind of way that we talk on these issues in the community. So the facilitator was quite important in making sure people adhered to that structure, because that's what built the trust and the safety, that people know that it's not going to turn into a negative disagreement, which is so much what's going on out there with LTNs, and that they can relax and be honest about what they're feeling. So once we got that structure established, we could let the structure go a bit and people could trust the exchange a bit more. People were invited to speak from their lived experience, not from their opinions. So in one example, one listening exchange participant said that when the LTNs went in, they could reduce their asthma medication by half. And the other person said, well, actually, I had to double mine because they live in different areas of the city. So that exchange was probably more connecting for them than if one had said, well, I've read a report saying LTNs increase pollution. The other saying, well, I've read a report saying that they reduce pollution. So this wasn't about changing anyone's mind, and it importantly wasn't about influencing policy on LTNs. This wasn't a process of consultation. So the report touches on questions of how we recruited people, the profile of the participants, and how we analysed the results. I won't go into that here in the interest of time. It was a pilot project, so we did 10 listening exchanges. Each was about 60 to 90 minutes. So what did we find out? One of the main results was that participants said they really felt heard and accepted in their view. And that was important, even though nothing was going to change on the ground with LTNs. So in answer to the first question, when you see a bollard, what do you feel? One person kind of answered, but it didn't quite get to the root of it. And as the process went on, he was mulling this over. And finally, he sort of got animated and he said, that's it. When I see a bollard, I feel I don't matter. That's it. He kind of was able to articulate quite a profound thing that was really irking him so much with these bollards. And the person who received that was able to receive that in an accepting way, which is really important for the speaker. Other things that people said was that they really got a good understanding of why people felt as they did. So one person who really liked LTNs said she just got such joy watching the primary school children going their crocodile to school in the mornings because the roads were safe so they could walk that way. And her listening partner said, yeah, right, I get that. I hadn't even realized that was happening and I see why that's great for you. And she also said, to be honest, before I came into this listening exchange, I didn't even know anybody supported LTNs, which shows how polarized we are. And she said, I'm just delighted to hear that people are benefiting, and particularly children. Even when views were very different, were expressed in very different ways, when we dug around a bit, we realized often the values underneath them were quite similar. So fairness was something that came up a lot. So people against LTNs often felt strongly that they were unfair. People living in one area benefited, people living in another really didn't benefit. And so that was one of the reasons they disliked them. Others said, LTNs are great because they're fair, because we've got to do something now to try and reduce CO2 emissions for future generations. So those two people weren't going to agree, and they had very different views. But when they realised that fairness was at the bottom of both of their positions, that was a connecting factor, which helped them see someone in a more human way rather than as a sort of idiot or selfish person, which is what is going on out there a lot on social media. Finally, in terms of the results, people often said that they realised they weren't as good at listening as they thought they were. And they said that they would try and listen more in future exchanges on these things. And possibly some said they were less afraid of discussions, knowing that they'd now had a positive experience when some of the experiences before had been very difficult. So where do we go from here? It's worth saying that this core approach can be applied in various settings. It can be used in policymakers' consultative approaches because it's a deep dive into rich information, getting behind stated positions, into motivations and why people feel what they feel, which can be crucial for policymakers. It can also be the first step of problem-solving processes where people with different views do come to common positions on things or agree a way ahead. But if we focus on the application, as in we were using them in this research project as a polarisation reduction tool, a key question is whether listening exchanges can be scaled up to have wider community impact. So it's important to keep the intimacy of the exchange because that's where the trust and the honesty builds. That's the kind of gold of this. So you've got to keep it intimate and small, but you could scale up potentially, and we could look into this potentially as the next stage. You could train facilitators in the community, in diverse communities in Oxford, who could host these listening exchanges on any subject, to be honest, and get it out there more broadly. Secondly, people could witness listening exchanges, either in person or recording them, and they could be shared. And finally, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that you could run listening exchanges with influencers, so people who are on social media a lot, or people in positions of leadership, and see if a listening exchange helps them soften the way they engage with these and express that externally, and whether that has a knock-on effect to everybody that they're interacting with. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Bex. Next up, we have Caesar. Please, the floor is yours.
Right. Do help me to keep the time. Yes. Well, thanks for having me. I imagine the reason why I was invited to speak is because in October, we had the launch of a research project that we are currently embarking upon. We've just started, called Antithesis. And this project is about how to do ethics and policy within context of radical value disagreements. So societies across the world are getting more and more polarized. And social media and other tools allow us to be able to retreat into echo chambers. And therefore, we can easily retreat into a group where we listen to those we want who think like we do. And therefore, polarization increases. And at the same time, we live in a society where our challenges and needs are becoming more and more intertwined and interdependent. So we have these two tensions. We're depending more on each other. We need more help from each other, and we need to collaborate in order to resolve some of the big problems we have. Think about climate change, antimicrobial resistance, migration, all those problems. We need to come together. And yet our ethos and our public debate is leading us towards polarization. So we are unable to address these problems. And we have a group of PIs working on this. And my part on this project is looking at communities, especially in the global south, which are communities that have an entrenched way of living that is pluralistic, diverse, and how they've been able to navigate this over the centuries. So when you talk about communities where there are really strong religious divides, ethnic divides, racial divides. And to launch the project, what we did was we drew from one of the African traditions called the Palavra Hut, which is a space that is generally created within communities for people to look for reconciliation. And the Palavra Hut is a space where people come in, and just as Bex, right, mentioned earlier, where you tell your story. It's not about debating arguments. It's about sharing your lived experience. And in a Palavra Hut, it's a community hut where people come together, sometimes actually a physical space, a hut. And even people who have committed hideous things against other persons can actually speak with their victim, speak in the presence of their victim. Of course, there are rules. You do not hurt other people. And the idea is you have the witnesses, disputants, artists. I can go on and explain this a lot. But it is a place where you generate a type of dialogue that is not only just a question of arguing to see who wins, but it is a question of learning to understand other people's experiences, both emotionally, and sometimes in a Palavra Hut, someone may want to tell their story with a song. There is other ways of expression. However, the interesting thing about the Palavra Hut and why it works is that it starts from a point which is linked a little bit to African, traditions of philosophy like Ubuntu, whereby, I am because we are, and all those slogans that are often repeated. But there is a stronger sense of community. And therefore, when you have a problem, even taking the bollards and the LTNs, it is not a problem of one group or a problem of another group. It is a problem of our community. And we will not succeed by just allowing one party to win. We all have to solve this because there are some people in our community who are suffering because of this choice. And so how do we come out of this together? That is the spirit of the Palavra Hut. So it's a we problem. It is not a me against you problem. So we held this at the Oxford Union, this launch at the Oxford Union, because the Oxford Union is a place of debate. And the place of debate is where you have, winners and losers. And what is more, debating is an act of actually rationally convincing people. But here, what we're appealing to is something that goes beyond just trying to use reason. And anybody who has tried to have an argument, for example, with a radical, I wouldn't mention any presidents today, but you know what I'm thinking about. Anyway, you realize that reason is not the way to go. So it is more about engaging with that other dimension, because and this is where I want to land with this. I could go on forever. What we need to realize is that we live within a moral environment, and this moral environment has a story behind it. And when we have polarization, it is an issue that rotates around identity and alienation. So there is a certain discourse that wants to promote a form of identity, a way of being, a way of knowing, and a way of acting within the community, within the society. If that way, that narrative is alienating to other people, then that alienation breeds resentment, and it can also coalesce into a form of grouping. And it is no longer just about reasons, it is also about feelings. Because societies, even though we claim to live in rationally grounded democratic societies, that is a lie we keep telling ourselves. And sorry to say, if you think about the way the UK rolled out the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, you can see why myths are important to societies. All the rituals that accompanied it. Societies need myths. We need symbols. We need rituals. And these are the basis then that allow us to be able to create a certain commonality, to be able to look for consensus. Because if we are serious about words, consensus has at its roots an idea of cum sentire. And cum sentire means to kind of have a feeling of togetherness. But if we keep promoting an ethos within our societies that does not take into account the fact that we are actually together, and there are certain things that we can only solve through our togetherness, then we will not be able to pull out consensus out of the hat whenever there are problems. And that's what we often try to do. We live as if we are not together, and all of a sudden when there is a conflict, we say, let's come together and resolve it. So we have to come together and learn why we are together and how we are together. So what does this mean for public policy? A lot of these radical issues, in my opinion, where there is polarization, cannot be addressed directly. They need to be addressed in the longer term plan. So we can even talk about our public spaces. How do the public spaces represent the diversity of our communities? I remember writing a paper 5 years ago during the Black Lives Matter movement and the debate around statues. And the point is that nobody hates statues. Why should I have a lot of, as we'd say in Africa, why should I have beef against a stone? Right? That is not the point. It is the point is that does this space make me feel at home? Or does this space keep reminding me silently that somehow I am not at home? So when we're designing our spaces, we need to take into consideration the diversity, and not just racial, ethnic. We can talk about gender, we can talk about disability. All these things need to make the spaces in such a way that we all feel that we belong. And once we all feel that we belong, then when we have a problem, we can solve it in a we way. If not, if we keep insisting on a single narrative of identity, which is represented in space, represented in the rituals that accompany our societies, that form is going to alienate people. And today, those people are going to coalesce, and we're going to have radical disagreements. And let us just keep in mind that our societies are destined to become more and more diverse and more interdependent. And either we change and revisit it, or we just have to use forms of oppression, as we're seeing in certain places, to silence other people and say they do not exist. But they will come back at you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caesar. Next up, we have Ed. Ed, the floor is yours.
Great, fantastic. Hello, and thank you for the introduction. My name's Ed. I work for an organisation called More in Common. We're a public opinion research agency and think tank, and we're focused on strengthening social cohesion and tackling polarisation in Western democracies. My day job involves using focus groups and opinion polling to help politicians, businesses, and campaigners better understand the public's shared starting points on divisive issues. I'm going to start by addressing the question of the seminar directly. In short, yes, I do think that polarisation can be addressed through community dialogue. We just heard some good evidence of it from Bex and Caesar. And there's lots of evidence from that in our work at More in Common as well. I'm going to give one example from the US, where the challenge of polarisation, as you know, is much stronger. And in particular in the US, we have what's called stacked identities, where people form their identities around not just one issue like immigration or abortion or gun rights, but around clusters of issues where if you know someone in the US's views on abortion, you're likely to know their views on a range of other issues. And we don't have this context in the UK. In the UK, we get much more fragmented coalitions of different groups of people agreeing and disagreeing on different topics. But in the US, the context means that they have high levels of what's called outgroup animosity or partisan animosity, feelings of negative emotion towards people who support the opposite party. So my colleagues in the US have developed an intervention which sounds quite similar to Bex's proposal of sort of encouraging people to listen in on other people's listening exchanges. So what they've done is they've showed Americans through sort of these randomly controlled trials in an experimental setting, these videos of people of opposite views discussing their views with people who disagree with them. And as in the listening exchanges, they're not talking about sort of their opinions or facts. It's more about their lived experiences and how these views sort of affect them personally. And we found that through showing people these short videos, through carefully designed sort of interventions, we can reduce feelings of animosity by 20 points on a scale of up to 100 points. And because these things have been tracked in America for so long, we know that that's the equivalent of taking levels of animosity back to where they were in the 1980s. So quite a significant intervention. Other challenges on this relate to the fact that the effects don't last particularly long. So there's important challenges there in terms of making sure the interventions are continuous and sort of encouraging continuous community dialogue rather than just sort of one-off moments. And in the UK, as I said, the context of polarisation is different and it's less partisan. And we don't run the same experiments as our colleagues in the US do in the UK, but we do see similar effects when we host sort of focus group discussions moderated by us on controversial issues such as immigration, or recently we've been doing lots of focus groups on assisted dying. And throughout those groups, we also see levels of sort of outgroup animosity, feelings of polarization towards the opposing side fall as people discuss their views more with others. But with all that said, I want to present a challenge that these findings lead to, which has been alluded to already before, which is the challenge of scaling. Even if the research does suggest that community dialogue can reduce polarization, it's of little worth if it's impossible to scale these interventions to meet the scale of the challenges of polarization that we face. So my organisation, More in Common, we were founded in the wake of the murder of Joe Cox and the divisive times of the Brexit referendum. In 2019, when we ran our first poll in the UK, we asked a representative sample of British adults, what's the top word that you would use to describe Britain in 2019? And often I show the word cloud. The big word is divided in the middle. Britons overwhelmingly felt that the country was divided and they wanted to see a way through the division. Well, we've been asking the same question every year since then. And for the last few years, when we've asked, how does the country feel? What word will you describe the country? The word divided has actually fallen out of the top 10. And now, clearly, the big word in the middle of this word cloud is broken. So we've tackled polarization, or people feel less divided, but in a much more pessimistic way. But this sense that Britain is broken has deep consequences for tackling polarization, because 4 in 10 Britons now say that democracy doesn't work for ordinary people, and a majority say that politicians don't listen to them. We run multiple focus groups a week with voters around the country, and in almost every one, there is a clear sense of hopelessness that the government can perform sort of basic duties of the state on things like healthcare and policing and crime. And the issue is, people see less of a point in things like community dialogue if they think that there's less chance that things are going to get better for them. So poor delivery on the things that people care about strengthens this sense that politicians can do little to fix things. And we find low trust in politicians is also associated with lower willingness to engage in community dialogue and civic engagement. And we also find that these low trust groups in Britain are also the most financially insecure and also the most time poor segments of society. So finding ways to get them to engage in community dialogue in a way that's respectful for their sort of time budgets and their lifestyles is really challenging, and particularly given that these groups often are the ones who both don't have the time and don't see the point in these sorts of interventions. So we do know that community dialogue can decrease polarisation, or at least it looks likely. But as I see it, the key challenge is making sure that the right people are in the room, not just talking to people who are already engaged on these issues, and making spaces where disengaged and disenfranchised groups in particular want to get involved, and being respectful of the fact that many people simply do not see the need to partake in this sort of activity. So we have spent a lot of time working at More in Common on sort of ways to involve people who might be disengaged in politics, or ways to sort of increase people's ability to see their common starting points with people who disagree with them in ways that don't require quite so much engagement and time commitments on their part. And I could talk about a range of examples. And we also see sort of the need for leaders to play a role in this. So it's not just on, say, disengaged people who have little time to get involved in community dialogue, but on people who lead them. So community leaders, politicians, to shape the narrative and sort of avoid stoking divisions further. I can give one example, but I can talk about plenty more in the discussion afterwards. But for example, when we poll Reform UK voters on support for scrapping net zero, if you just say outright, would you support or oppose scrapping net zero? They're pretty split, about 50-50. If you say that Nigel Farage says we should scrap net zero, do you support or oppose it? Their support goes up by 30 points. So these leaders do have a real role to play in shaping people's viewpoints. And it is partly not just on people who aren't necessarily so engaged in politics, as often sort of voters of more extreme parties are, but particularly on sort of leaders to try and find ways to sort of avoid the temptation to stoke division further. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ed. Last but not least, Kate.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks very much for having me. I'm Kate. If you're a bit disconcerted by all that is going on here, let me assure you I've got another month. So hopefully not calling on any of your midwifery skills. Most of my time at the moment is spent developing a new organisation called the Social Gym, which is all about helping people to improve their social health by strengthening their relationships. But the real reason I suspect I'm here tonight, am I not close enough to the mic? Yeah, okay. Is because of my capacity, my former capacity as design director of Larger Us. And Larger Us is a small, not-for-profit organisation that explores how change makers, so people like activists and campaigners and politicians and broadcasters, can more effectively counter polarisation and fragmentation, especially in the UK, but internationally as well. And while I was there, I designed and led the prototyping of a programme that we're now scaling up, which is about training people to have more constructive conversations about climate change. And these are conversations that happen spontaneously in our everyday lives, the kind of conversations you might have around the dinner table or at the school gates or, you know, in a queue for the bus stop. And I should say that the skills were highly transferable. So if you can talk about climate change, really, you can talk about anything. And indeed, trainees last year were using the skills that they learned to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the killings in Southport and all the kind of myriad issues that arise in day-to-day life. So just briefly, why did we run this training? Why did we think it was so important? Well, as I think I don't really need to explain, but climate change is the new sex, politics and religion of conversation. It's the taboo subject that many of us steer away from, partly because it's so controversial and partly because it's also seen as really quite a depressing subject. And research shows that over 60% of non-activists never or very rarely talk about climate change. So that's really a lot of people. And one of the problems with that silence is that it is being misinterpreted as meaning that we don't care and that people aren't interested. And that in turn leaves the mic open to people who have really strong opinions on the subject. which implies that we're way more divided on it than we actually are. What it also means is that politicians don't feel that they have the social mandate that they need to make change in the area. So in essence, we really need to normalise climate as being part of our everyday lives and everyday conversation, and something that everyone can feel confident to talk about. So as you can imagine, we learned a ton from running all of this, but I'm going to give you sort of 5 points for my 5 minutes to throw into the mix for our conversation this evening. So first of all, an encouraging one. People really want to learn these skills. We were slightly dazzled by the level of interest we had in this training, the number of people signing up, the number of organisations wanting to run it out. It basically seems like a lot of us are aware that our common approach, our standard approach is not working and want to find different tactics and just learn different ways to have more difficult conversations. Secondly, one of the most difficult things that we have to teach as part of the training is a paradox. And that is, namely, that if you're very unlikely to change someone's mind if you make it your objective to change their mind. So I think Caesar alluded to this point earlier as well. And we all probably know that from plenty of personal experience, how off-putting it is when someone is hard selling us on something that we're already feeling a little bit ambivalent about. And how sort of suspicious it makes us feel. Basically, no one changes their mind because they've been bullied into it. But it's also hard to accept what that actually means, which is that we have to focus on building a relationship of trust and mutual respect with people on the other side of the debate. It's only through such relationships that we can have influence. And that's why facts and statistics don't work. Again, another point that has been made, but stories and emotional connection does, because they speak to us at a relational level. So my third point, another thing that's quite hard to swallow, and that is that to build a relationship of trust and mutual respect, we have to also be demonstrably open to being challenged ourselves and being changed ourselves. And I don't mean change at the level of our core values or our beliefs. I don't mean that we will suddenly stop thinking that climate change is a big issue. But I think it means changing our assumptions about who it is that we're speaking to and what they might be thinking. And we have to do that, we have to work against some really hard stuff because it's neurologically wired into us to categorize and stereotype people. And that's really, really difficult in real life. It sounds quite easy, but it's really difficult. The fourth thing that I want to bring into the room, and this is one of the challenges of it, is that a lot of people don't think this work matters because they think that the relational approach is weak. That it's some kind of wishy-washy compromise. And maybe Bex can speak to this more, but the value of listening is really not sort of commonly recognised. Finding a middle ground is confused with giving way, rather than being what it really is, which is an increasingly radical countercultural achievement and the path out of violence and stalemate. So really, as I see it, the task of leadership now at all levels is to make the case for this kind of change making. And the fifth point, to briefly mention, but it does seem wild that the vast majority of us are never taught these basic relational skills. We teach kids how to debate at school, at some schools, but we don't teach them core conversational competencies, like how to listen, or how to ask good questions, or how to respond when you're feeling triggered or angered in a conversation. And those really matter, partly for our social health, our ability to build and maintain meaningful, fulfilling relationships. But what we're also saying is that those skills really matter for us at the level of civic health. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for these really inspiring pitches. And you gave us, I think, a lot of food for thought. We now have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. And I would invite the audience to ask questions, make comments for our panelists. if you have a question, please introduce yourself briefly and say where you're from. I see a question in the front here.
Hello, my name's Wayne. I'm from Oxford. Thank you. Great contributions from all of you. I really enjoyed what you said on this important topic. My question relates to an issue that quite a few of you mentioned, which is the problem of scaling up and reaching larger numbers of people. I'm just wondering if you could comment on what's happened in Taiwan, where Audrey Tang started a movement in which the vast population was able to be consulted about important policy issues using AI to help people to bridge the differences between them. And it was extremely effective. In fact, it increased the trust in the government from 19% up to something over 80% over a period of a few years. So I think it's an extremely effective technique, but I'm wondering what you think about that and whether you think it's possible that we could use that more.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm massively inspired by that example as well. And something I'd really love to explore more is, I mean, basically it's pol.is, Polis, was the online platform, and how it works, and others might well know this a lot better than I do. People are asked a question, and then anyone, wherever you are on the internet, you just write in your answer to that question, and then the algorithms themselves group people according to their common interests, and then the AI comes up with a statement that most people are going to agree with. So it's super, super powerful. And correct me if you think I've got any of that wrong. So I think that's got a lot of potential. I'd love to, the element there's also the human element of drawing out the values and the human connections behind people's different views. So I think AI can help us in that way and can help us come up with policy positions, but there's still work to be done on why people believe what they believe. And that's getting underneath it and the motivations and the sharing of stories. And I still think that has to be done. But I've got some kind of dream about how you could interlink the two. So you use the online stuff to come up with fairly clear positions. And then there's a second phase where you get the humans involved and you start digging under people's positions.
If I can just add to the last point there, I think the AI tools are very important. Part of our project, we have a group that is working on using John Rawls's reflective equilibrium to listen to conversations, use them on big data to be able to sort of like understand what people are thinking in order to be able to engage more around certain issues. But there is data. At the end of the day, something that I think is important is, and has been mentioned, is a kind of a spirit of a magnanimous spirit towards those who disagree with us. When people stand for things that we can't even imagine ourselves identifying with, the initial hypothesis that we need to work with is that they must see something good in that. And the engagement then becomes, is this the only way, the way they're going about the good that they're pursuing, is this the only way to go about it, or can we share in that good in some way? In our field, for example, in bioethics, where sometimes there are issues that are quite dividing. Take something like female genital cutting. Before condemning somebody, I need to think that this is a practice that sometimes is carried out by women on women. Mothers take their children to engage in this. I believe that the mothers love their children. And if they're doing something like this, it means they must be seeking some good. Now, the thing is to try and be able to unpack the good that they are seeking. And we've done work on that. It would be too long to go into the details of the type of values that they see in this. And then the conversation becomes, is this the only way through which you can achieve these goods that you're looking for? Or are there other ways, other pathways that together we can explore to achieve this good without perhaps generating such harm or damage in achieving it? But part of the act of listening that we're talking about is that capacity to respect the person we disagree with and assume that, start with the hypothesis that that is not a bad person. There must be something. I mean, I could even make a case now for, MAGA supporters and what the good that they are seeking. But then I may differ in how to achieve that good. But if I start with a condemnation, then we won't get anywhere. Or if I think they're stupid, that's even worse.
Great. I'll just be very quick. I only know small amounts about the Taiwan example, but I thought worth talking about. In the UK, we often get asked when a council or a developer has a really controversial. They've tried to plan a new solar farm or a new housing development, for example, and they launch their public consultation. The process basically is just extremely flawed in the UK. They'll get all the noisiest respondents, the people with the strongest feelings, and the majority of people who are much sort of less concerned or have less stronger views don't write in, because why would they? And they'll often commission us to do research, and we will go into these communities and we'll pay people to take part in focus groups for us. So we're sort of mitigating the fact that it's not just people who want to do this in their free time. And they get a completely different story about the local development, and it sort of turns whoever we're working with, whether it's the council or a developer, that their views of sort of the genuine opinions of people on their head. The other thing I will say about online engagement is that also is pretty broken in the UK, in that essentially we don't really have a formal mechanism for it, but we do have some very active community Facebook groups and community groups online where people do discuss these things in very polarized and quite sort of toxic ways often. We, as part of our regular tracker polling, we do a thing called a feeling thermometer, where we ask people about people in their communities, and we ask them to rank on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is you feel very sort of coldly towards someone, and 100 is you feel very warm towards someone, different characters in the community. So at the top of the list, people feel very warm towards nurses and firefighters in their community, like you might imagine. Then you've got sort of teachers and doctors and postmen, for example. And then right at the bottom of the list, you've got MPs, local councillors, and people who post on local Facebook groups. So there's this issue in the UK where it's like people who are engaged in these things and want to share their views often end up in sort of embroiled, heated debates which don't sort of necessarily represent the majority of the community. So if we were to have a scheme like that in the UK, obviously it needs to address some of that.
Thank you. I don't have a huge amount to add to this. I think some brilliant points have already been made. I think the only thing I would say is to add to the question of how do we make sure that we reach a truly representative and wide range of people with tools such as AI. I'm also conscious that everything digital and technical has a habit of ironing out the messiness of humanity. And the way that we communicate with someone in person is very different to the way that we communicate with them online. Something is, and I don't think we fully understand this, something happens at a biological level that it's much more complex. And I think that we risk something if we put all our eggs in the AI basket, even though it does have a lot to offer and it could be a useful starting point or training ground.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Hakan Altanay. I'm a recent academic visitor at Oxford. For the purposes of this event, I'm also associated with the Center on Generous Listening at Tufts University, which touches on a lot of the things you mentioned. I also run a school of politics in Istanbul whose only business is to bring people that are on the complete opposite sides of the spectrum, and it works like a charm. So first, I want to salute your brilliance in addressing this issue. You were very impressive. And I would then plead that you be kinder to yourself and magnanimous towards yourself, not worrying that, not being able to take these things up to scale is the final thing we should say. That think about all those people who want to treat us as with an instrumental agenda, who want to sell us things and sign us up on their political agenda, versus any chance of being listened to as a citizen, as someone who shares a destiny, as a space. That we used to have these fireside chats where we knew we would be heard. We no longer have them. We are, so just having this conversation, and I salute the organizers for doing this event, extremely important. So let's have a bit more patience. I would argue that a conversation, a good conversation, is the single greatest innovation of humanity. We are not even close to maxing out on its potential, but we are very close to maxing out on not using this. Okay, so let's give ourselves some space. Let's experiment a little. Let's be a little patient. Conversations etymologically means changing together, not necessarily converging, but changing together. This is why it's so different than debate, that where you start as a finished product and you don't really engage. A conversation is based on the premise of you somehow touching me and me having at least the theoretical possibility of seeping into you. That's huge. So just because this didn't get us to solve every single problem means nothing. We are just at the beginning of this. So thank all of you for doing what you do, and let's do more of it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your very important work. My name is Maria, and I'm a DPhil PhD student here at Oxford, and I research anti-gender movements. And Ed, you said something that really resonated with me, which is the importance of looking for a shared starting point on divisive issues. So my question to all of you is, what are the key starting points, the shared starting points that you are able to identify across different issues? And if you ever encountered any issues in your experience where you are unable to find the shared starting point, and how do you manage this challenge?
Me again. On the LTN thing, what emerged, some of the listening exchanges moved towards people just working out what they agreed on. It was a kind of natural progression. And everyone agreed that congestion in Oxford is problematic. Everyone agreed that buses were important. Everyone agreed that school run times were the worst things. So quite practical stuff, because we were dealing with a practical issue. So once the trust had been built in the ways that we've been discussing, then people naturally moved into, people found those areas themselves, and I wasn't guiding that. It came out on its own. So that's the kind of concrete answer to that one. I'd probably hand it over to others, I think.
We can always find a common point. And I mean, if we're just going to follow the example of the UK, if people say things are broken, that's a common starting point. That's a shared starting point. And the shared starting point is that there is always some amount of discomfort. And the reason why we try to engage around issues is that not everybody is happy. And at least everyone wants to be happy. So, there is no issue that I can imagine that we cannot find a common starting point. And that is where we need to build. And the thing is, and this, a beautiful conference that Amartya Sen gave here at Wolfson College, I think in 2011, where he was talking about, reasoning and disagreement, and Isaiah Berlin Memorial Conference. And he makes a point that, In these things, what we need to do is to focus on the shared goals, the shared desires, and not so much on the shared theories. We can arrive at shared desires even through different belief systems or different reasoning, different forms of reasoning. But if we're able to identify these shared goals, which can seem very abstract at the beginning, yeah, everybody wants to be happy, or everyone wants to be able to travel around Oxford and feel comfortable, or everyone wants to be able to breathe clean air. I mean, they seem very abstract. But if we start there, we can then begin to say, what does this mean in real life, in day-to-day life, for each and every one of you? And this is where our stories come in. But I think we can always find shared points.
I don't have too much to add, although I will say what you said, Bex, in your speech about often fairness is the shared starting point, and what people disagree on is sort of what's fair or which groups are sort of more threatened by a specific policy or change. But at the end of the day, they want fairness. They just see the challenge differently. To your question about sort of where it's been hardest to find a shared starting point, we research all sorts of divisive issues, and immigration, climate change, sort of the culture war stuffs. Honestly, generally, it's you can get to a shared starting point, and on immigration, for example, we often say that sort of regardless of people's views, the general British public, they want control and compassion, and that's a generally shared starting point on immigration, for example. But where it becomes hardest is where I found it personally hardest is when there's religion involved, essentially, or where it's tied to identity. So the two topics that have come up recently are assisted dying, where some people's religious views just make them see the issue in a very different way, makes it very hard for them to agree with someone who holds a different view. And on Israel-Palestine as well, people tie their views to that conflict, to their own personal identity. So regardless of whether they have a shared starting point or want the same thing, because their views are tied to their own identity, it becomes very hard to deconstruct it. And I think generally sort of a worrying thing about more polarized societies, like I say in the US, where there's a strong Republican identity and Democrat identity, is that even if people have shared starting points, their views are tied to their own identities, which make it much harder to sort of see them.
Thanks. The evidence on climate communications is really clear that to get people to care about climate change, you have to link climate change to what they care about. So the whole point of a climate conversation, a constructive climate conversation, is to discover from curious, open-minded, open-ended questions with the person that you're speaking to what they care about. So one of the outstanding topics that comes up again and again is family. People care about their families, they care about the future of their children. And that I think is one of the key points that we can use, but everyone is different, and part of the joy of these conversations is appreciating that and finding the thing that connects us at the bottom.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we've reached the end of our time for tonight, and I think it's clear that the topic is far too complex to uncover in just one night. But keep your questions and maybe engage in a conversation over drinks, which will start very shortly. Before we wrap up, just a quick reminder that our next seminar will be in week 8 of Trinity term, on the 12th of March, and it will focus on regional building hubs and will be chaired by GCHU's co-director David Howard. So please mark your calendars. We'd really love to see you again for another engaging discussion. But for now, let's take a moment to give our speakers a round of applause.